Snow had been falling on Aspen for 3 days in a steady hush, softening the world into a map of white and amber. It lay like a promise on the pines and the stone steps and the broad slate roof of the Hail estate, and it pooled in the great foyer like a second, quieter sea. Preston Hail stood by the door, with his hand on the brass knob, and the memory of the last time he'd stood in a doorway and been happy, Sarah's laugh at the sill, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear, felt as fragile and distant as the skeleton of a moth. The house was too big for one man. It was too full of empty chairs and half-finished evenings. When the envelope came, it slid under the outer door and stopped at his boot, as if the house had finally taken pity and returned the world something unexpected. Gold foil glinted on the seal, an agency crest pressed into the paper like a small sun. There was no return address. He recognized the stationery immediately, an arrangement he'd authorized by phone 2 weeks earlier, the kind of practical solution a man of his age and means sometimes chose when feelings had to be outsourced. Companionship for a child, temporary, an adult presence for the holidays, contracted through a discreet match agency that specialized in placing women who could keep a house warm in ways money could not. He read the single line in the agency note: engagement begins upon arrival, terms limited to companionship and household assistance for the minor. There were no promises larger than that. Preston had liked it because it read like a business transaction, efficient, controlled, non-binding. He had not imagined it would come wrapped in snow and blue fabric that shivered at the edges, nor had he pictured the woman who answered the knock. She stood on the threshold with her shoulders square to the wind, a thin, threadbare blue dress clinging to her, a shawl wound about her shoulders, though her hands were bare. The dress was patched at the hem, stitches made by someone who knew how to make rough fabric hold its shape. Her cheeks were rose from the cold, her dark hair caught in a single braid at the back, and in the crook of her arm she carried a small bundle of her possessions wrapped in a scarf. She looked at him with eyes that did not beg. There was something about the plainness of her face that made him imagine a seed head ready to unfurl. "We're expecting you," he said. The words were more a fact than an invitation. "I am Amara," she said. Her voice was steady. She set her bundle down and extended one gloved hand toward the envelope at his feet. She hesitated only a breath before putting it into the plain care of his palms. He glanced at the gold-foiled seal, then at her, and realized with an odd private amusement that the world had reduced his grief down to a line of copy: companion for minor. What exactly did that mean? A governess? A housekeeper with a soft way about her?
A woman hired to stand between a grieving father and a grief-struck child and do what their family could no longer manage? Before he could answer, a small voice came from behind him. "She's pretty," Theo said, stepping into the hallway with the careful shuffling of a child who had practiced being small. He held something in his fist, a wooden bird the size of his palm, its beak nicked, paint worn from hours of being held between thumb and forefinger. He called it Chickadee. The carved feathers were rough, but the eyes were burned in with a painstaking little ember. Theo's thumb rubbed the bird's back, as if smoothing the grain could also smooth the rough edges inside him. Amara knelt as if she had always expected the gesture, lowering herself until she could look Theo in the eye. "Hello, Chickadee," she said, as if greeting an old friend, and the child blinked, surprised at how the bird and the woman seemed to belong to a shared private world. Theo did not talk much. He had stopped talking the way people stop using certain verbs when the verbs break around them. He had stopped drawing the sort of familiar pictures that said "we," and instead made houses with one figure or trees with no names. He had been 7 for nearly 3 winters now, and Sarah's absence had narrowed him into something careful, a creature measuring distance between himself and other people. Yet in the way he unfurled his hand to show Amara the carved bird, Preston saw, the sight of it felt like a small bell, how immediate curiosity could still reach him. Amara's fingers brushed the bird where the paint had been smoothed away. "You made this?" she asked. He nodded. His voice came like ice breaking. "I cut it at school. Mr. Havel showed us." "That's a good bird," she said simply. She did not fuss or gush. She sat back on her heels and, mindful of the snow, examined the bird as if it were the most important artifact in the world. She hummed a thread of a tune under her breath, soft, unhurried, a lullaby whose intervals seemed to sit in the same place as his memory. It was a tune Preston had heard once in the kitchen with Sarah when the kettle hissed on the stove. He found himself listening for it as if it might stitch his brittle days together. "Would you like to come in?" Preston asked, baffled at how the question already felt like crossing a line. He had meant earlier that morning to ask for a companion to keep Theo company while he navigated meetings and dinners, something polite, unobtrusive.
He had not imagined this being, this quiet person who seemed to know how to kneel in the snow as if it were a small, clean altar. Amara shook her head at the jacket he offered. "Thank you, I can keep the shawl." She tucked the edges about her and stepped inside as if she belonged to the house's long shadows. The foyer swallowed the snow.
The log fire in the great room breathed amber warmth, and for the first time since the funeral, Preston felt the almost ridiculous sensation of a house responding. There was a line in something Sarah had left behind, a sealed letter in his study that the movers had left unopened and that he had not had the courage to break. He had once told himself he would open it on the day Theo could understand it. The envelope still sat on his desk like a flat, patient thing. He told himself he would not be sentimental about this arrangement. Policy made grief manageable. And yet, when Amara sat at the kitchen table that afternoon and began to tidy, the movement of her hands felt like an answer to a small prayer he'd refused to say. She tied Theo's shoelaces without fuss, showed him how to dry a pan so it wouldn't streak, and in a voice steady as a metronome, read him a passage about a fox and a winter orchard. Theo laughed once in the swing of that story, a sound like a locked room breathing out. Preston watched from the doorway. Razor sharp, he catalogued each motion, how Amara turned the page with a thumb that bore a faint whitish callus, how she wiped flour from her hands onto her skirt, leaving a ghost of white like a small constellation. It was not heroism, it was daily skill. She retied Theo's mitten with a patient knot, and then, without being asked, set a pan on the table, took eggs from the crate, and made pancakes. The smell of butter and cinnamon spread, and the house remembered itself. He wanted to remain an observer. He was practiced at it. But the sight of Amara handing Theo a plate and leaning toward him so their shoulders almost touched made tears come to his eyes, not in grief's rawness, but in recognition that the shape of care could be deliberately, carefully rebuilt. He sat down at the end of the table like a man taking the small seat his life had left for him. That night he found charm in the ordinary, the way Amara flipped a pancake with the same soft precision with which she mended a ripped cuff. There was dignity in her work. It did not ask for pity. By the time the first day had smeared itself into evening, the house felt different. Theo slept in his usual room, the small light in the corner throwing shadows of crooked papier-mâché stars against the ceiling. Preston stood in the doorway watching the child breathe, and thought of a line he had kept folded in his head since Sarah's wake. "Grief is love that has nowhere to go." It had been phrased on a scrap of paper she left in the kitchen, the sort of maxim she favored, practical and oddly consoling. Preston had not wanted to give the words power, but now, as he watched Theo, they felt less like accusation and more like instruction. The presence of another person in the house offered that wayward love a place to land. A day bled into another with soft domestic rituals. Pancakes, carrying bundles of kindling, Amara's hands moving over Theo's scraped knees as she applied a thick bandage, the carved bird tucked into a stocking by the mantel. Small things piled up until a new order began to take shape. Preston found a small wooden plane in the garage, tools Sarah had used for minor repairs, and on impulse he sat with it and began to shave a dowel into a form. It was an awkward, clumsy action at first. The shavings collected at his feet like pale confetti. When he finished, he had something that looked like the beginning of a toy. He realized he had not done such a thing in 10 years. Amara noticed. "You're a carpenter?" she asked with no ceremony. "Not professionally," he admitted. "There are things I can do." "You have careful hands," she said. "They belong to someone who has been trusted with the making of small things." He smiled at that, a small, private smile, and then felt slightly ashamed that he had never trusted himself with such making since Sarah died. He returned to the garage the next afternoon, and Theo would follow him sometimes to watch the scraps turn into something with a beak and a wing. Theo began, slowly and not without missteps, to show Preston how the world could be reclaimed in the small. He carved under Preston's supervision. His little blade made a crooked notch, and Preston adjusted his fingers around the child's to teach him a safer grip. The bird grew in the boy's hands, and with it a faint line of connection threaded between father and son. Outside those hours of quiet, Aspen could be its own rumor mill. Word traveled faster in small towns than snow in a storm. Marion, who ran the consignment shop 2 streets down and swapped stamps and small confidences like currency, recognized Amara the first week she unsettled her chair on Marion's front porch with a cup of tea. Marion folded cloths at the counter and watched a woman with no pretense about fabric and thread tell a story about teaching a class of children to sew mittens during a winter outreach years ago.
Marian's eyes narrowed pleasantly. "You came from the agency, didn't you?" Marian asked, gentle and sharp. "I did," Amara said, smoothing her skirt. "I've been matched for a season." "You look like someone who could mend anything," Marian said, and in the way she said it was both compliment and invitation. Marian had been small-town muscle in matters of goodwill. She kept lists of retired teachers, drivers with trucks, and people who baked extra pies for kids whose parents worked too late. She also kept a name card shoved in the cash drawer labeled the Hail Foundation. When she learned which house Amara had gone to, she did not scold. She made a face, and then, with the kindness townspeople used to keep one another honest, offered to bring over a casserole. Not everyone in town used the same collar of neighborly curiosity.
Elaine Carson, who had a habit of arranging her life around propriety and what looked right when judged by others, saw photographs on Marian's social feed, a pale woman in a patched blue dress handing a paper bag to a charity bake sale, and a cold thought settled. It looked like charity without consent, and charity done publicly, Elaine believed, was hazardous to the good name people worked so hard to build. Her husband had sat on the board of the Hail Foundation for years. She knew which appearances moved donors and which moved them away. She had long thought the foundation's purpose needed to be defended from sentimentality. On a weekday, when the snow had melted to slush in the gutters and footprints lined the edges of the lane, Elaine ran into Amara outside the grocer's, where Theo had been coaxed into carrying the eggs in. She observed the patched hem and the way the woman's hands smelled faintly of flour. Elaine adopted her signature expression, one part disapproval, one part wounded righteousness. "You really should be careful with impressions," she said loud enough for a couple of shoppers to overhear. "Not everything is wisdom dressed as charity." Amara's face did not flare. She tilted her head like someone listening to the wind. "Impressions can be truthful or kind," she said, as if offering a definition rather than an argument. "I choose kind when I can." Elaine's mouth thinned. She made a note to call a board member. It was the kind of ripple that felt like a pebble dropped in still water, small and certain. Inside the house, not all ripples were external. Preston's confidential assistant, Carl, came by with a stack of papers and an expression that had been rehearsed for years to indicate both efficiency and restrained concern. He stood awkwardly in the corner while Amara braided Theo's hair, because Preston had left his desk to watch them. "Sir," Carl said finally, "there has been interest. The Foundation's board asked me to flag that the charity events are in 2 weeks. There will be guests. Some of them are concerned about optics." Preston looked at him with a slow, tired calculation. "They are always concerned about optics," he said. "Optics keep the checks coming and the speeches crisp. Some members feel a new household presence, an arrangement they didn't pre-approve, could complicate messaging," Carl added. The sentence was careful, aimed at softening the blow, but the meaning landed like a stone. Complicate messaging. He watched Amara hand Theo a wooden spoon to play with, the spoon's handle worn by use, and felt suddenly protective, as if the world around them had sharpened itself to a new, unseen edge. Amara heard the conversation because she was near enough to be practical about earshot. She did not look surprised. "The board tends to fear what it does not know," she said, measured and steady. "But I do not intend to be a spectacle. I'm here to help them be a family." "Aren't you worried?"
Carl asked, not cruelly, but as a man who had learned to ask the practical questions. "The Foundation has standards. There are donors to consider. People talk." Amara sat down at the table and folded her hands around a steaming cup. "I was not born into their world," she said. "I've been on the other side. Children like Theo, people who needed a warm hand. What worries me is not whether the board speaks, it's whether anyone will bother to listen." Preston did not reply to that, because the truth of her sentence landed on something he kept locked away. He had been listening to what people said about their lives for years, and he had found that listening was rarer than speaking or judging. His life had been a series of transactions disguised as decency. He had built a foundation to extend his wife's legacy in ways that kept their name on the grant letters. He had not expected his private failures to become public debates. For a long moment he allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope, that Amelia's presence might be a small remedy, that routine could outlast interrogation. The household settled into a cadence, Amara teaching Theo to braid, Preston returning late from meetings but lingering longer in the doorway, Theo's wooden bird occupying a place on the mantel as if it were a totem. The green shawl Sarah had liked to wear, bright, almost brazen against the austerity of the house's upholstery, was draped over the back of a chair. It seemed ludicrous, and yet its color drew the winter towards something living. Amara noticed it and once, without asking, smoothed its fringe.
Her fingers had a way of touching that implied possession through remembrance rather than demand. At night, when fires burned down to a soft glow, Amara would sit by the window and sew the collar of a sweater with neat economical stitches. She hummed the lullaby sometimes. Preston, passing by, would catch a fragment and feel the old affectionate ache for Sarah. He began, to his surprise, to leave Sarah's sealed letter in the top drawer of his desk that he sometimes opened and sometimes did not, but he began to think of reading it aloud one day, a small ceremony he could manage in front of a boardroom, or perhaps just for Theo. The letter's edge had a faint perfume of lavender, and something else, cinnamon perhaps, and the line he would carry in his head came back to him with a different weight. Grief was not a failing, but a direction for love that needed somewhere to go. He thought of offering it, not as an abandonment of decorum, but as a piece of truth. As the house grew quieter with winter, a different kind of noise began at the edges of their lives. Stories traveled from Marion's coffee counter to the cash register, and then, with the speed of the internet and the town's appetite, into the lifeblood of the Tribune's small but hungry office.
Marion, who treasured good stitching and better intentions, had mentioned Amara's background to an old reporter who had a soft spot for stories that looked like quiet miracles. She taught kids to make mittens, Marion said. She knows how to keep small things from breaking. Elaine overheard Marion's conversation and took it as confirmation of her suspicions. A picture of Amara at the bake sale, hands dusted with flour, a shawl at her shoulders, made its way into a neighborhood feed where people shared both outrage and delight in equal measure. For some, the sight of a woman in a patched blue dress at the house of a billionaire in Aspen was a jarring contrast. For others, it was a small, hopeful rupture in a world too used to polished charity. The photograph showed Theo handing a plate to Amara, Chickadee tucked under his arm, and the comments below the image began to align like flurries around a heat lamp. Preston received a call from Paige Landon the evening the photograph went live. Paige sat on the Foundation's communications committee and had the practiced air of someone used to smoothing language into acceptable forms. "Preston," she said, "we need to talk about the house. The board is uneasy, there's chatter. Donors have questions." There it was, the word again, questions. He put his forehead against the window and watched the snowfall blur the streetlights into long, gentle strokes. "She is not a spectacle," he said finally. "She is not charity. She is a woman employed with dignity." "Perception matters," Paige returned. "You know that. Miles is quite concerned, and Elaine has already made a note. We can manage this, but we must be proactive." Preston thought about the agency envelope on his desk. He imagined the neat lines of the contract, the small box checked off, temporary placement, limited engagement. He thought of the carved bird on the mantel, of Theo's small breathing in the night, and he realized that in a way the agency had underestimated what they were sending. They hadn't sent an accessory for his life. They had sent a person whose very presence would rearrange his days. He put his hand over the envelope as if that might protect what had come through it. "Let them ask questions," he said, "but we will answer with ordinary things. We will let the child's laughter and the way the house runs speak for themselves." It was an answer that felt both reckless and accurate. For all his money and influence, he could not buy immunity from human judgment. He could not legislate kindness into the world. He could, however, choose whether to sit in the engine room of his own life and make decisions that matched the small, stubborn truth that had arrived with the envelope. Some people come not to be rescued, but to offer repair. Days later, when the town's curiosity had ripened into concern, Elaine took a more formal step.
She called one of the board members, whose name carried weight, Miles Braxton, requiring a review of the household arrangement. Miles was the sort of man who liked clean solutions and tidy narratives. He raised the idea at the next committee call, where Paige was careful to parse words, and Carl tried to manage the tone. "We owe it to our donors," Miles said. "The foundation is governed by standards, and a household placement that could be construed as improvised is problematic." It was not yet an emergency. No calls had been made to press, no cameras had been assembled at the gate, but the motion had been placed like a match in a dry house. Preston received the notification of a preliminary review and was asked to be available for a brief discussion. The letter was courteous but firm. It spoke of fiduciary duty and the importance of maintaining public trust. He and Amara were in the greenhouse that afternoon. The glass was rimmed with hoarfrost, and inside the air smelled of damp earth and the tang of seed-starting trace. Theo was there, knees tucked under him, coloring a family portrait that included a small wooden bird perched on the back of a chair. He had colored himself with a wide, embarrassed grin. Preston wore a tie that was too long, and Amara had drawn herself in a patched blue dress. The color was the same as the one she actually wore, delicate and true. When Preston told her about the board's letter, Amara did not look surprised.
She had been expecting that the world would test her in exactly this way, the charity that offended the sensibilities of those who measured virtue by their balance sheets. "They are afraid of what can't be counted," she said, touching the soil of a small pot where someone had planted a few seeds. But seeds don't ask permission to grow. He found himself unexpectedly reassured by that plain sentence. He had been thinking in margins of statements and donor reports. She spoke as if life were less an accounting than a habit of care. He liked the habit. Outside, people had started to notice small things. Someone snapped a photograph of Thea walking home with Amara one evening, their shadows long and close on the snow. A neighbor sent the photo to a friend at the Tribune with a note, a strange and lovely arrangement. Marion, who had a sharp sense for when a story needed nurturing, suggested bringing a brief human interest piece to a reporter she trusted. "It might help," she said. "We can show them the way she works with the kids. It might remind people that sometimes dignity comes in ragged sleeves." By the time the board's preliminary note arrived, the house had tasted the warmth of small domestic miracles, and also the thin metal of scrutiny. Preston folded the letter and put it into the same drawer where he kept Sarah's sealed note. He did not open either of them yet. There was a moment then where he understood the story as more than snow and contract and mismatched hems.
It was about choices, the choice to let love have somewhere to go, even when doing so invited criticism. The choice to stand by a person with a patched dress when the world preferred the polished and well-presented. He thought of the man who had written the agency note, the person who had boxed human needs into a line item, and he felt a gentle contempt. There was a small private rebellion that felt mounting inside him. If a woman in a patched blue dress could coax a 7-year-old to press his bird into the world again, then perhaps the foundation could still do what it had once promised, to be for people, not for appearances. When he voiced this to Carl, he expected reasoned resistance. What he got was a thin sigh and the line he'd heard too often. "There will be questions, sir." "There always are questions," Preston said. "Sometimes the answers are slow. Sometimes you have to choose who you want to be while the questions are being asked." Amara, listening, tucked a tiny green sprout into a pot with her fingers, and Thea watched her as if she were a slow, bright sun. "We are not riches by paper alone," she told him. "We are riches by what we keep." Preston liked the way she said it. He liked the clarity of her grammar, and how it skipped the sentimentality he had been trained to wield. It was the phrase he would later, unexpectedly, remember when the board's concern sharpened into something louder. For now, it held like a small rope between two people on a frozen night. A week later, as the house filled with pine-scented air and the Christmas lights outside the windows began to hum like distant constellations, someone took a different photograph. This was not Marion's hopeful piece, but a picture made by a neighbor who had been passing on a snow-plowed road and saw a figure in a patched blue dress carrying a sack of seedlings toward the Hail greenhouse. It was framed for contrast, wealth and want, place and person, and sent off like a small stone. The photograph traveled faster than anyone expected. Comments began to collect beneath it, some tender, some sharp, some anxious. People debated whether a billionaire should be seen with someone the town saw as needy. Others defended the idea with words like humanity and second chances. There was no middle ground in the feeds for the way the town had been schooled to choose sides. Preston read the comments with a calm that surprised him. He had expected to feel defensive, and found instead a curious steadiness. He thought again of the envelope, of the gold-foiled seal, of the small legal box of terms by which a person had been rendered into a service. Whatever the world decided about appearances, Theos and all pale bird had re-entered their lives as proof of something else, that tenderness could be grafted back onto a family if someone practiced the grafting day after day.
The next morning, a courier arrived with a note from the Foundation's board, an invitation to discuss community perceptions, and a request that Preston make himself available for a brief advisory meeting. The phrase community perceptions felt clinical and vast all at once, as if those words could catalog every whisper and make them disappear. Preston folded the paper and kept it where the letter desk would find it easily. He did not crumple it. He was not yet the kind of man who flinched from the calculus of power. But as he looked at Theo's sleeping shape on the sofa, and then at Amara, who had been up early sewing little mittens for the community outreach, he felt the weather shift in a way that was not meteorological. The house was warmer, but beyond its doors, someone was beginning to measure the warmth and write about it in ways that could freeze it. That evening, as lights twinkled in the long windows like a small constellation that belonged to no single person, Preston took out Sarah's sealed letter and turned it in his hands. He did not open it. The thought of reading her words aloud at a board meeting to remind people of the Foundation's original charge for the poor, the fragile, the overlooked, seemed both strategic and sacramental. He wondered if doing so would sway Miles and quiet Elaine. He wondered if it would matter at all. He had not, until then, allowed himself the indulgence of believing that one person could change the atmosphere of a house, or that a woman who had come by an agency envelope and stood in a patched blue dress could, by small action, begin to reweave the fabric of what held them. But there she was in the greenhouse, kneeling and planting seeds in darkness, humming a line of a lullaby that felt like a thread between memory and repair. The seeds would not sprout on command. They would demand a patience that the town might mock or the board might misread. Yet to Preston, the seeds were the right response. He closed the desk drawer and for the first time in a long time went downstairs to the fireside. Theo woke and padded in, clutching Chickadee, and slipped into Preston's lap as if the years between them had been braided rather than broken. Amara came with 2 cups of tea and set them down on the table without fanfare, and in that small domestic communion there was a rebellion against every polished PowerPoint and donor bird file. It was not an elegant rebellion. It was a broken-in mitten and a carved bird and the scent of butter warming in a pan. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, untroubled by the arguments that would come for them. The board would, in a matter of days, convene. Elaine's displeasure would sharpen. Miles would say words that had lost the capacity to surprise him. A reporter might show up with a notepad and an appetite for contrast. That storm would come. But for this evening, the house held its breath like a person on the threshold of a decision.
Someone would have to decide where they stood. Would they defend a woman who had arrived in an envelope with a gold foil seal? Would they unroll their values into public view and let the town see what had been stitched inside? The answers had not yet been required. For now, the story hummed on the edge of possibility. A message blinked on Preston's phone as he watched Theo draw an attempt at a family. 3 stick figures, one with a bird perched above their head. The notification was a polite, formal request. The board sought an emergency discussion about recent developments. Preston read it once and then again, the screen's cold light bright against the warmth of the room. He felt, with the quiet recognition of a man who had built empires and still misread the human weather, that the house could be rocked by scrutiny. He folded the phone back into his palm and looked at the 2 people who had, without ceremony, remade his winter. He reached for the small wooden bird on the mantel and turned it in his fingers. The carvings were uneven, but the beak had a hopeful tilt. He thought of the gold seal, of the agency that had thought of human connection as a line item, and he thought of the word that had emerged from Sarah's letter and lodged like a small splinter, love that needed somewhere to go. He set the bird down beside the green shawl and stood up. "Tomorrow," he told them, his voice both a decision and a question. "Tomorrow we'll face them. Tomorrow we'll face them. If this story has touched you, tell us where you're watching from." The next morning rose slow and pale, as if the sky were still thawing from the night storms. Snow lay in clean ridges along the drive, and the Hail estate had the peculiar hush that belonged to places accustomed to being large and quiet. Preston moved through it with a deliberateness that felt at once strategic and shy. Small tasks steadied him, tying laces, filling the kettle, transferring kindling in a burlap sack. He dressed in a dark suit, the fabric chosen for business, and yet his fingers lingered on the green shawl Sarah had favored. For a moment he considered folding it into his coat as if some small color might armor him against the day. Theo, always awake early now when there was a question of the house, padded into the study holding Chickadee as if he were carrying news. The wooden bird had a nick on his wing where Theo had tried, with an earnest but clumsy hand, to replicate Preston's carving. "Do they have real chairs at the meeting?" Theo asked. His voice bore a child's idea of formalities, the earnestness of someone who believed meetings might include cookies. "They will have chairs," Preston said, smiling, even though it felt as if he were testing a word he once used with ease. He knelt down and ruffled the boy's hair, the gesture small and ordinary and somehow bracing. Amara entered then with a basket of mittens and a thermos of hot cider.
She had spent the morning finishing a row of tiny, faultlessly knit hearts to stitch to the scarves the Foundation's outreach program planned to distribute. Her hands smelled faintly of soap and wool and the faint dust of seed-starting soil. "You'll do fine," she said to Theo in a voice that skipped noise and went straight for steadiness. She did not say, "I believe in you," as encouragement so much as an instruction that the world could be counted on for small mercies. Preston found himself grateful for the simplicity of that faith. The drive to the Foundation's offices was brisk. The building had glass that reflected the sky like water, and a stone facade that pretended to be an institution rather than a house of carefully managed human relationships. Inside, the staff moved with a readiness Preston had cultivated over years. Schedules, bullet points, contingency plans. He had spent enough of his life turning impulses into policy to know how to dress the messiness of care in the language of governance. Today, those two modes would collide. Miles Braxton was waiting in the boardroom, hands folded on the polished table as if it belonged to him. His eyes were those of a man who had been given the job of keeping edges sharp. Paige Landon had prepared a packet of talking points and a list of donors to call. Elaine Carson arrived with the particular steadiness of outrage, as if she had rehearsed the exact timbre of disapproval she would use in the meeting. Walker came in late, apologetic, his expression undecided in the way that belongs to people who measured fairness against convenience. Carl stayed on the periphery, watching Preston with something that was nearly, if not quite, anxiety. The cameras from a local morning segment were not present yet, but the board's assistant had already arranged a small seating area for the press should they choose to attend. There was a low hum of expectation, as if the room itself was braced for either a storm or a thaw. Preston sat at the head of the cable and unfolded the board's agenda. He could have treated this as a mere procedural obstacle, something to be scheduled and handled, but the presence of Amara in the house had altered the arithmetic of his life, and he found the idea of finessing her away into a neat bullet point unbearable. He had been a man who hid his emotions in neat margins for a long time, and now those margins were no longer comfortable. Elaine spoke first, with the economy of people who believed language could perform the world. "Mr. Hale," she began, "we're concerned by the optics. Donors are asking questions. There are standards for a reason. We must consider the best interests of the foundation." There was an elegance and a cruelty in how she used the word standards. It meant donors' comfort measured more than lives. Preston listened.
He thought of the photograph that had circulated, a brief tableau of Amara with flour on her hands and Theo handing her a plate, and the way strangers had sharpened it into a moral test. He thought of Chickadee's small beak, and the way Theo had looked at Amara as if she belonged in the room by right. When it was his turn, he rose and, without a preamble, drew Sarah's sealed letter from his inner jacket pocket. He had kept it shut for too many reasons to list: anxiety at exposing a private grief, fear of assigning a burden to a public body. But today he knew he would read. If the foundation was to be used as a shield against discomfort, then it had never been what Sarah had started. He would remind them of that. "I asked the agency for a companion for a minor," he said, and his voice did not have the clipped corporate hue it often wore. It had a tremor that belonged to someone who had come to the meeting as a private person as much as a chief executive. "I expected tempers and receipts. I did not expect a person who would change the life of my son." The words in this letter are Sarah's. I have not read them in public before. I hope you'll tolerate the sentiment. He slit the envelope with a small blade and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Sarah's, kept, precise, the loops at the end of her sentences like small signatures of care. He read aloud the line he had carried in his mind for weeks, not in the exact phrasing she had used, but keeping the sentiment faithfully intact. Grief, she had said, was love that had nowhere to go. Not an accusation, she had insisted, but a direction. Love needed a place to land. Preston did not give a long speech. He said simply that the Foundation's charter was written to serve people at the margins. He said that the image of a billionaire household hosting someone who could teach children to tie mittens was not in itself scandalous. It was the Foundation's purpose. He spoke of how Sarah had insisted their philanthropy be practical rather than ornamental, that the funds should create spaces where hands could learn what hands could do. He said finally that he had seen in a week how quickly a child's laughter could change the acoustics of a house. There was a quiet in the room, the kind of quiet that checks whether a person has a true center. Miles leaned forward, and with the kind of corporate politeness that had been rehearsed, asked about terms and contracts. He wanted to know whether the agency's agreement had been violated, whether the placement was temporary or indefinite, and how donors might be reassured. Preston answered directly. "She is designated to be here for the season. But if temporary is the opposite of useful, and I think it often is, then I must decide whether to use my authority to keep what actually works. My son is happier. The house operates better. The outreach programs are running smoothly. These are measurable things." "It is a matter of perception," Elaine said.
"And perception governs the giving public. We must be judicious." Marion's voice, when it came into the room, was unexpected. She had arrived without ceremony, A woman in a heavy coat still smelling faintly of the oven and the bright lemon-scented soap she favored. She did not have an official seat at the board, but she had been invited by a few members who had known her decades. For Marion, the moral calculus was simpler. She had seen Amara with children. She had seen how the woman could turn a tempering moment into something that gave a child confidence, and confidence tended to multiply. "I brought a photograph," Marion said, sliding an image across the table. It was the one of the bake sale, Amara with flour on her hands, Theo handing over a plate, Chickadee tucked under his arm. "This woman's work will be seen by children who have little else. I know what it is to let your hands learn a trade. People in this town remember how to do that for each other." Her phrase was plain and unembellished, not a PR line, not a polish. "Do you know how many letters I had on the counter asking, no, demanding, that she be allowed to stay? People want this." A murmur went around the room. Paige, who had been composed for the conversation, checked her notes. A young associate from the Tribune had called earlier that morning, asking whether they could interview the foundation for a human interest piece. Preston had agreed on the condition that the piece be allowed to tell its own story. He had not expected what Marion would set in motion. She had, perhaps unbidden, handed her copy to the same reporter and suggested a visit to the greenhouse. That afternoon, a short handheld video appeared online. Marion's neighbor had filmed Amara at the community center, demonstrating how to knit a mitten to a small circle of children. The clip was quiet, no dramatic music, no staged angles. Amara's hands moved, deliberate and true, and one little girl, satin-haired and intent, looked at her as if she were watching Oxygen. Theo sat in the back, delicately turning the wooden bird on his knee. The clip was captioned with Marion's short note. "Sometimes dignity is a pair of warm hands. Watch what happens when we teach them." The video spread with a speed that surprised the town. The Tribune ran a short profile that evening with the headline that would later be quoted in longer essays. "From mail-order envelope to mended hands, a town remembers its better self." The piece did not sensationalize. It simply told the facts. Amara had taught children mittens. She had worked for years with outreach programs, and here she was, not asking for pity, but giving practicalities. Commenters on the piece were swift, and many of them were people who had remembered the Foundation's original mission when it had been younger and less concerned with optics.
Preston watched the coverage in his study, while Theo slept beneath his father's desk for it, as if the world had dwindled to a place big enough only for them. The story's circulation felt like a tide. If boards measured their success in dollars and designations, towns measured in memories and faces. He thought of the donors who might call to complain, and of the donors who, when reminded of what the Foundation promised, might choose to give because their values matched the work. He thought, finally, that there were things in life that required a brief exposure to sunlight to flourish. The board convened again. This time the press asked for a seat at the meeting, and Preston, now practiced at balancing exposure with privacy, allowed a live stream. He had decided that if the Foundation was to be judged, it would be judged in the open. He wanted to put Sarah's words and the realities of their home where people could see the mismatch between rhetoric and purpose. Elaine's argument sharpened. She spoke of donor confidence and the potential for a slip in the narrative they had carefully curated. "Our donors give because they feel secure in the stewardship of their gifts," she said. "If the public perceives the Foundation is acting out of sentiment rather than strategy, it could imperil funding." "Is it sentiment to keep a child laughing?" Preston asked. He did not raise his voice. He merely made the question into a point of policy. Donors should not dictate who we are in private. If our mission is to support the fragile and overlooked, then an act that restores a child to the world is exactly the kind of work we should be willing to count. At his side, Amara sat in a chair not meant for her class, her hands folded around a small notebook where she had written down the names of children who might benefit from extra mittens. She did not perform. She simply listened with the clear attention of someone who believed that lives were a sequence of small acts. When asked to stand and say who she was, she rose and said, "I teach, I mend, I keep what I am given useful." Her voice was without flourish, but it landed in the live stream like a simple bell. There was a moment when the boardroom felt like a stage and also a confessional. Walker, who had been noncommittal in private conversations, surprised most people by speaking honestly. "I remember why we started this," he said quietly. "We wanted to repair what the world had broken. It's easy to forget that in donor reports, but we did it. I have seen this woman and watched children respond. I'm not voting for optics, I'm voting for the work." Walker's vote was a fulcrum. Miles and Paige exchanged looks.
Miles, who had been the board's voice of tidy pragmatism, suggested a compromise.
institute a short review period to assess effects on outreach metrics and public response, and in the meantime, formalize a community liaison that would include Marion so that voices from the town could be heard in the foundation's decisions. It was a corporate solution that, unexpectedly, aligned with Preston's instincts, bridged the world of reports with the world's lived realities. Elaine bristled. "A liaison will not satisfy donors," she said. "We must maintain our standards." Preston, who had learned a certain economy of force, replied simply, "Then let us set the standard properly. Let our metric be the children who no longer need the mittens because they have learned to make them. Let our reports include the number of kids who laughed over a pancake. If our donors cannot accept that, then perhaps they are funding a brand and not the mission." The board voted a temporary stay on any removal of household personnel, the formation of a small committee to assess impact that included Marion and Walker, and a public statement that the foundation would recommit to hands-on community work. It was not a full-throated victory, but it was enough. It was the kind of pragmatic resolution that could be filed and reported, and also, importantly, comprised a moral stand. As the live stream cut to the feed that many had been watching from kitchen tables and office desks, comments poured in. Parents grateful for the mittens, people who had worked with the foundation years ago and recognized the smell of soap and seed-starting soil the column described, a few critical voices that, like the wind, could not be fully shut out. Elaine left the room unbowed but altered. Her posture had not softened, but her argument had found itself in a minority. She had expected to shape perception. Instead, she was confronted with memory and human testimony. It disturbed her not because of the principle, but because her position challenged how easily she had been able to influence outcomes. Outside the meeting, Marion and a Tribune reporter spoke to a line of people who had gained courage from the live feed. There were volunteers who offered to help at the community center, an old teacher who remembered Amara from a mittens class years ago, and a donor who called to say he would match the next round of small grants if the foundation committed to listing impact numbers for hands-on work. The town's voice, amplified by coverage and social media, had tipped the scales. Preston returned home with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done what he thought was necessary. He walked through the foyer and paused at the mantel, where Chickadee sat beside a small stack of wood shavings. Theo came running, his cheeks flushed from play, clutching a crayon drawing that had, in the margins, expanded. 3 figures now held hands under a sky where the wooden bird hovered like a guardian. "You did good," Preston told the boy. He meant the children who had responded to Amara. He meant the choice he had made. He meant, in some small way, himself. For Amara, there was no victory lap. She continued her work as she always had, knitting, teaching, repairing. Yet she was aware of the new attention. She received in the days after the meeting letters, handwritten, earnest notes left at the greenhouse door, thanking her for returning a sense of possibility to children who had not had much. A few people she did not know slid envelopes under the greenhouse door with small donations to the community center sewing program. There was a photograph sent by an anonymous neighbor of a child's crayon rendering of a mitten labeled "Warm Hands, Warm Heart." It made its way to Marion and then to the Tribune as a small human interest addendum to the larger story. Not everyone changed, but the balance of voices shifted enough that the Foundation's board, chastened and forced to listen, initiated a review of its charter that would take months but that signaled the willingness to realign. Preston did not claim victory. He had learned the vanity of pronouncing final ends. Instead, he worked with Walker and Marion to hammer out practical deliverables, a community advisory role, quarterly impact reports emphasizing hands-on programs, and a small granting stream designed specifically for programs that taught sensory and practical skills to children. Elaine, watching the board's slow reorientation, realized she had misjudged how stubborn communities could be when they remembered their own better instincts. She softened her tone in private, perhaps because she recognized that a new language of service might include her and the people she had feared would be endangered by sentiment. People who love appearances are sometimes capable of learning what to preserve beneath them. At home, the winter eased into a brittle clarity. The household returned to its quiet rituals. Preston and Amara began in small increments to share tasks without naming them as romance or duty. He would bring seeds to the greenhouse and watch her teach children to press soil around them. She would watch him in the garage shaping a small dowel into a bird and, without fanfare, hand him a cup of cider. There was a mutuality that was ordinary and rare. Shared labor, the exchange of small jokes about misaligned halters, the passing of a favorite tool. Theo's recovery was the slow, unglamorous labor of ordinary time. There were setbacks, a quiet evening where he closed himself into a book with more force than necessary, and triumphs, an afternoon when he took Preston's hand and, for the first time in months, asked if they might go to the park. The wooden bird survived these small dramas, losing paint and gaining nicked edges, but in each new mark it seemed to grow more like a map of their lives. There was inevitably a moment of public vindication that felt both strange and rightful.
A neighboring town had posted a series of photographs about grassroots work during the holidays, and one editor at a metropolitan paper had pulled the story about the Hail household into a longer piece about community memory. A photograph of Amara teaching a child to sew, this time with a focus on the hands, the folded fabric, the intense concentration of the children, appeared with a caption, "Dignity in Practice." The piece ran online and in print. People wrote to the foundation offering to volunteer their time rather than their money. The conversation shifted texturally from what donors gave to what townspeople could do together. With that momentum, Preston proposed a modest, firm proposal to the board: create a greenhouse program under foundation oversight that would serve as a training center for young people and open a small community center with weekly workshops on practical skills. He suggested that the foundation publicly measure impact by counting not only dollars, but the number of hands taught and the number of children who learned a practical skill. The board, moved by the public reaction and the clear evidence of the work's effects, endorsed the plan. There were dissenting votes still. Elaine had not become an advocate overnight, but the charter review moved forward with an urgency that matched the season. One gray morning, in the greenhouse rimmed with frost, Preston placed a framed copy of Sarah's letter on the wall near the seed trace. He had not relocated it for show. He had done it because the language in the letter had become a centerpiece for what they were trying to remember. The sentence, paraphrased with care, not to weaponize but to guide, hung near the plants like a prayer for work. Grief is a form of love asking for a place to grow. People who came through the facilities would read it and perhaps think of their own ways to shape the sentiment into practice. Amara did not ask for a title. She accepted instead a small key to the greenhouse, a practical gesture, and the trust to design a program for children who came in one afternoon a week. She planned a curriculum that included making mittens, basic woodworking, reading aloud, and planting seeds. Marion managed a roster of volunteers. The community center reopened with a modest paging, no fanfare yet, but the room filled quickly. Families came with pots of cuttings, with small plates of cookies, with timetables of work schedules, and sat down to learn how to stitch or carve or coax a seed into life. The first seed planting ceremony took place on a slushy day in late January, when the snow had given way to a slow, muddy thaw. Preston, who had resisted public spectacle, stood at the edge of a raised bed and handed Theo a small packet of seeds. Amara crouched beside the boy and showed him how to press the seeds gently into the soil and cover them with a soft dusting.
Theo's fingers were patient and precise. He practiced burying small treasures into the earth with the reverence of someone making a promise. "Seeds like being counted," Amara said to him, in a tone that was half joke and half instruction. "They keep their own timetable, but they like it when someone remembers them." He nodded solemnly, then jabbed a tiny hole with a stick, tucked in the seed, and patted the earth with a careful thumb. Preston pressed his own hand on Theo's shoulder and felt a small, fierce gratitude for the ordinary domestic rights he had previously given away to schedules and deals. This was not a rescue or a show. It was a decision to keep performing the small acts that licensed hope. The foundation filed the charter amendments in a dry pile of paperwork that nevertheless felt like a stone set into a new foundation. They created a community advisory panel that included Walker and Marion, and quietly offered Amara a formal role as program coordinator for the greenhouse. She hesitated before accepting, not because she did not want the responsibility, but because titles had a way of gilding what should remain practical. In the end, she agreed, and her acceptance was met with applause not of headlines, but of people who had seen a child learn to tie a mitten. Months later, as the winter slowly eased toward signs of spring, the greenhouse was full of seedlings pushing up through dark, warm soil. A narrow slat of the greenhouse roof had been fitted for Theo's bird, which Preston had carved into a small totem. They had called it, half in affection and half in joke, the chickadee post, a small place where the wooden bird could watch over the green things. Theo drew the bird in crayon and left the picture taped to the window. It was framed later on the wall of the community center beside other child-made artifacts. The social response had a bracing afterlife. Some donors left quietly, others increased their grants in response to the board's new commitments and the vivid testimony of families who signed their names to thank you notes. The foundation's annual report, when it came, included both fiscal transparency and a simple section listing hands taught, mittens knitted, and children who cried less. The metrics were humble and stubborn, and over time, compelling.
Preston and Amara found their relationship not in grand demonstrations, but in the infrastructure of daily life. They carved a bird together one afternoon in the garage. Preston more awkward at first, Amara steadier, showing him how to angle the cut. Their shared laughter at Preston's first misshapen beak felt like a reconfiguration of the house's acoustics. They did not orbit one another with dramatic pronouncements. Instead, they built in practice. He would fetch an extra cup of tea and leave it where she might find it between classes. She would stitch a warm patch on a jacket he liked to wear when he went into the garden.
There were moments when their hands brushed and their eyes met, and the feeling that rose then was not a leap, but an accumulation, like compost, layered, patient, and sure. Christmas came the following winter with the same kind of hush that had marked the first one, though now the hush held the soft echo of shared tasks. The Hail estate's lights sparkled as before, but the house leaned toward warmth. The community center held a holiday workshop where children learned to make bird ornaments from scrap wood, and Preston handed Theo a small carved bird he'd made himself. Theo, who had once been narrowed by grief, now had a stack of drawings on his desk that included a family labeled with names and small depictions of the greenhouse and Chickadee watching over them. On Christmas morning, they sat at the kitchen table with pancakes and cider. The green shawl Sarah had liked was draped over the back of a chair, not as a relic but as a color thread that meant continuity. Amara had baked small buns. Her hands were flour-dusted and steady. Preston opened Sarah's sealed letter, not to expose a private thing now, but as something to share. He read aloud the sentence that had guided him and the board. Grief is love that has nowhere to go. This time, the words were not for argument, but for settling. They listened together and let the sentence do what good sentences do. It put a name to what had been happening and made room for what might come next. Theo drew a picture then, 3 figures and a wooden bird above them, with the greenhouse in the background and a patch of green sprouts labeled Our Garden. Amara pinned it to the community center's corkboard, where, at the end of the day, other drawings had gathered. The board would later be filled with not only words but lists of people who would teach, of items to repair, of seeds saved and donated. It was the record of a community learning to measure itself by care. There was no sudden coronation. The foundation's shift was the sum of choices, minutes of decisions to teach rather than perform, donors who chose to believe, volunteers who showed up in snow and mud and bright sunlight. Some things never changed. Markets still called, and members still complained about optics from time to time, but the new axis of their work, what they measured and whom they served, was harder to reverse. One evening, as spring began its white-knuckled whisper, the town held an opening for the new community room. The mayor gave a short speech, Marion made jokes, and a reporter from the Tribune wrote a neat, affectionate piece about the labor of small hands. People brought casseroles and flowers and left with knitted mittens. Preston stood a little off to the side and watched Amara teaching a circle of children how to tie a simple knot. Walker stood nearby with a glass of cider, looking like something who had discovered a better way of measuring success. Preston walked up to Amara then and handed her an envelope, unmarked, unsealed. Inside was a small key, not a government key, but a symbol, a certificate appointing the greenhouse as a permanent part of the Foundation's programming. Amara looked at it, then at him, then down at the children, whose fingers moved awkwardly but certain over fabric and scraps. "You're doing good work," he said, and the words felt new to him but honest. He did not offer grand promises. He offered recognition and resources. She tucked the key into her pocket and smiled, the sort of smile reserved for those who do not confuse gratitude with favoritism. "We are doing it together," she said, and that phrase, ordinary and true, felt like a compact. The town, which had once been quick to choose sides, now had a record. The community center reopened, the greenhouse thrived. Board members had learned how to listen to people rather than only their ledgers. Marion kept her counter stocked with a list of volunteers. Theo's drawings multiplied, each new one folding in more details. A school, a small crowd making mittens, a bird with wings spread as if to hold the whole scene. In a quiet moment not long after the opening, Preston found a place on his study wall and placed a modest frame containing Theo's drawing. It hung near Sarah's letter and the small wooden bird that had become a fixture of their shelves. Amara, passing by, ran her finger over the frame's edge as if blessing it. Their life had not turned into a fairy tale of riches lavished. Rather, their affluence had been redirected, less toward private display and more toward sustaining small, stubborn work. Months later, on a morning bright with a thaw, Theo led a class of children to a patch in the community garden and with great ceremony planted the first seeds of the year. He had written their names on little bits of twine and tied them to small sticks. As he pressed the seeds into the soil, he looked up at Preston and Amara and felt for a moment the full weight of belonging. The bird they'd made together watched from a trellis, and the green shawl Sarah had loved lay folded on a nearby bench as if to ward the garden with memory. The work that began with a gold-foiled envelope had not been a way to manufacture warmth. It had been an instance of people choosing labor over pretense. Amara had not been rescued in a cliché of riches transform lives. She had arrived with tools, stitches, a steady voice, a patience for small things, and the family that formed around those tools was built on mutual trust. Preston had not undergone an overnight conversion. He had been thawed, piece by patient piece, by the sound of a child's laugh, the patience of a woman who kept her hands busy, and the insistence of a town that remembered why it mattered to care for one another. It was, in the end, not a tale of a poor woman becoming wealthy, but of a community rediscovering its measures. The Foundation's charter had been amended to prioritize hands-on work with measurable community impact.
The greenhouse stood as a practical symbol, not a trophy, but a factory of small changes. Theo's wooden bird, the original chickadee, sat mounted at the greenhouse arch. It was nicked and fancier for the carved work Preston had learned to do, and above it there was a small placard someone had made with the words they now tried to live by. Second chances are made by hands. On a late afternoon that smelled faintly of earth and the last of winter snow, Preston walked with Amara along the greenhouse rows. They carried a bag of seeds and an understanding that had grown quietly and honestly. He handed her a seed packet. "For the garden," he said. She opened it and read the name written on the label, Hope Mix. She smiled, the expression that folded gratitude into something actionable. "Then we'll water it," she said. Theo, who had been shadowing their footsteps, stopped to add his own small drawing to the greenhouse wall. A house, 2 adults, a child, and a bird flying like a promise above them. He labeled it in his earnest handwriting, My Family. There were no curtain calls, no declarations of eternal perfection. There were stitches and mittens that frayed and were repaired, board members who sometimes reverted to old habits and were gently reminded of the Foundation's promise, and days when the seedlings failed to sprout and had to be replanted. There were also mornings when the greenhouse smelled of damp earth and cups of tea, when a child learned how to shave a dowel without cutting a finger, when a letter came from a woman in the next town whose life had been altered by the patience of volunteers who taught her to sew a seam. On the anniversary of Amara's arrival, Preston found the agency envelope folded in his desk drawer. The gold foil still glinted like a small sun. He held it up and thought of the strange alchemy that had turned a bureaucratic slip into a cascade of consequences. From rags to riches, someone joked at a town meeting once, intending mockery, but the phrase that stuck in his head was truer and less flashy. From need to usefulness. The town, the Foundation, the house on the hill had all been rearranged not by money alone, but by an insistence that work, honest, patient, shared work, makes people. At the greenhouse door, the wooden bird chickadee watched them, its beak tipped optimistic. The green shawl lay over a bench where a child might rest her mittens. Sarah's letter was still on the wall, faded by sunlight, but legible. Grief was a direction for love that needed somewhere to land. Preston and Amara had chosen to let that love land in a greenhouse, in a community room, in a boy's small hand. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Like and subscribe for more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary work, of small hands, steady hums, and the ways a single envelope on a snowy doorstep can rearrange a life.